Hello everybody. So today I'm just going to do a really quick painting tutorial, very simple. So the five main ingredients you want to have are your surface to work from. I recommend working on canvas. I usually use an unstretched canvas, which basically means it's just coming out on a roll, and then you stretch it around a frame and staple it. Then you have your nice fitted canvas. Sometimes I like to paint ahead of time on a piece of stretched canvas, and then I will wrap it around the edges of a frame, and I mark the edges with either pencil, or in this case I did an underpainting of gray paint that I scraped with my nail into the paint to show where my little folds are going to be. So that's the part where I would wrap it around the edge of a canvas, then staple it, and then hang it on the wall. I'm actually working on paper today. That's fine too. The thing about painting on paper is that paper will really absorb your paint, and if you're working with something like acrylic paint or watercolor, then that's going to dry out really, really fast. If you're painting with acrylic or oil paint on a canvas, on gessoed canvas, then that will dry out a lot slower. Acrylic dries pretty quickly. Oil dries really slowly. Oil can take it can take up to days sometimes to dry, depending on how thickly you apply the paint. Which leads me to my next part. The other ingredient you need is your paint. So I like to use a glass palette. That's what the paint goes on. You just squeeze it out of the tube, and then you mix your colors on the palette itself. The reason I use glass instead of like a paper plate or a piece of cardboard, which I do sometimes, but glass is preferable because, again, it's not porous like paper. It's this like harder surface that doesn't absorb the paint, so it keeps it from drying out, which is really good if you're mixing colors. And I'll just get to that part in a second. So the next ingredient you need is your paintbrush, obviously. I use like a rounded tip when I'm painting more finer details, and then I would use a broader kind of flat brush to do like a big swashy background, because you can just cover more space and you don't need to be getting into fine details with your backgrounds. Maybe you can, but just to get like the broad strokes of what covers the background, you want to use something that's a little bit bigger. Okay, so to mix paint, you take your paper. Oh, last ingredients, of course. Sorry. Water for mixing and washing out your brushes, and a trusty paint rag for cleaning off your paintbrushes. And then I always wear, protective clothing so that I don't get my paint. When I was in college, though, that's not true. When I was in college, I was the kid who was always walking through campus covered in paint. Hands, mouth, clothes, all of it. Anyway, so I have my paintbrush. I have my palette. So I've already done a little bit of mixing here, as you can tell. But what I start with are the primary colors: yellow, blue, red, and then I use white. The reason I don't have black on this palette is because I was trained to mix your own black. That way you kind of have a more variety in the shades of black that you have. It just looks better usually, and it's a lot more interesting. If you have like a straight black on a painting that has like a billion other little mixed colors in it, then it can look really weird and inky and like it's not supposed to be there. So to mix colors, and like sometimes when I paint, I'll mix like just to have like one area of my painting, let's say, has green. I will mix like 6 different shades of green, and sometimes I'll mix it ahead of time. Sometimes I'll mix it as I go, and sometimes I'll mix it directly onto the canvas. Depending on what school you go to, they might be like, don't ever mix your paint on the canvas, only mix it on the palette. I feel like there's more than one way to skin a cat, especially when it comes to painting. So you figure out what works for you, and you experiment, do everything. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you guys how to mix some of these colors. So what I'll do is I'll make a green, because I already kind of started, and I'll take a yellow, start with a lighter color first, because that's less messy, and then I will grab some of that Prussian blue, and by grab I just mean take a little scoop with the tip of my brush, and you mix that in. And you really want to make sure you're using the tip of your brush and not letting the paint go down to the bottom right here where the metal connects, because that can really screw up your brush pretty fast. Plus, it's just not really where you want to paint from. But again, more than one way to skin a cat. If that's your style, like my brother-in-law, he's an amazing painter. He loves to screw up his brushes. He has like 6,000 craft brushes in his studio, and it's just part of how he works. So I'm going to apply some of that green onto the paper. Goes on pretty thick. If you do really chunky layers of paint, that's called impasto. And then I can add some water to dilute and thin out this color so that it's a little bit more washy. And it goes a lot further. Pretty cool. So that's also fun to experiment with. I'll rinse my brush. Typically, if I'm mixing paints, colors, I'll use one brush for like blues, greens, and cool colors. And I will use a different brush for pinks, reds, yellows, and warm colors. So, it's starting to drip. And another way to keep your, another great reason to use a glass palette instead of a paper palette is you can clean off the palette and it gives you a lot more room. Also, this is a tiny palette. I have worked with like super big plate glass to get really broad palettes. But for today, we're using this. So I have my clean, different brush. So I'm using this for my reds and my oranges and my pinks and my yellows. And I will just make a nice orange. So I take the yellow. Again, good to start with the light color first. And then I will scoop out some of the red. And I'll mix that orange. Maybe a little bit. And so I'll show you right now the reason why you want to use that. Why you want to go for the lighter color before the darker color. And it's going to show up right here. I'm like, oh, this color needs more yellow. So when I go in to get that yellow, when I grab it, it leaves like this red residue stain. And that makes it a little harder to get the purity back. The purity in something like this red, it's such a strong hue that it doesn't really get that affected when I mix in some of the yellow. But this yellow is like now completely corrupted by that red. Whoops! Alright, so now I have this orange, and I apply that in a little, maybe it's a little gloppier. Yes, gloppy is the technical term. And then I'll dilute it so you guys can get that same kind of interpretation. So diluting it will make it a little thinner, a little more transparent, a little lighter in color. So a lot of times people will think that to lighten up their color they need to add white. You don't. Adding white can make it more chalky, more of a pastel. I'll show you an example right now. And if that's what you want, that's rad too. But now I have this like super chalky orange, and right next to each other. Oh, you can't tell because this is a bad camera. Try to get a little closer. As you can see, when they're right next to each other, this kind of washy watered down orange still has a lot of that vibrance, whereas this white with the orange has now made this kind of like chalky salmon color. So, something to think about. Adding water to dilute your paint and adding white paint to dilute your paint. Same goes with dark colors. No, that's not true. You can't dilute a color with a dark color. But think about that one. Look it back to you. It's now like a philosophical painting conundrum in my head. Cool. So, that's how you make orange, red and yellow, super obvious. And then you can make, we already made green, we already made blue, purple. So purple's kind of tricky. I always add this hue called Alzerian Crimson to my palettes. It's over here. It's kind of like a magenta, and then you mix it, I'm mixing it with white to make it pink. And you can mix it with more red to make it pink. All the different reds will interact differently, and it really stands out with white. That's not purple. I said I was mixing purple. So, yes, that crimson. I'm rinsing my brush right now. Always rinse your brush between colors, unless your intention is to have a murky color. And by murky, I just mean like when you're a kid and you mix all the paints at the same time. So yeah, I'll take some of this blue. And I'll take some of this crimson. And maybe a little bit of the red. And I'll mix it. And I have this nice dark purple. Ta-da! And then again, I like to dilute it, and you can dilute it on your palette by adding water directly to the palette to dilute it, or if you've applied it really thick, do it with red this time, you have that, and you want to dilute it on your canvas, you get your paintbrush wet, and you can dilute it on the canvas itself. It really just depends what sort of look you're going for. If you're doing more like, you want the naturalist look and you want things to be kind of more photorealistic and you're doing really like tiny little minute details, you mix it ahead of time on your palette and then you get in there. Because you're making super deliberate choices. Usually in the beginning, your painting will look washy. That's like the underpainting. That's like your first layer, your first draft of paint, and then you just keep adding layers of paint on top of that. And the top layer is usually when you can get into some of the like super fine little details. See if I can do a little example of that. So let's say I wanted to write something on here. First thing, to make sure there isn't too much water on my brush. I can tell that there is, but that's because I just have a feel for it. You'll develop a feel for it over time if you're painting for a long time. I want my brush to be super fine tip. There's lots of different types of brushes out there. Some are really expensive, some of them are cheap. The more expensive, obviously, better quality, but you can usually go for a mid-grade and be totally fine. They just last longer when they're a little bit more expensive. They're just higher quality. The longer it lasts, the easier it's going to be to paint with because all the brushes stay together. I think I have an example of a crappy brush right here. The difference between the two. So this one is made with like boar's hair. It's either boar's hair or a synthetic hair. I'm not sure. Thanks for starting your truck outside right now. Boar's hair or a synthetic hair. It's going to be a lot coarser. It's more likely to like break up faster. This is much more expensive. This is a squirrel's hair brush. And I also take better care of my brushes now because I have learned a trick where you use conditioner when you're washing your brushes. Um, and that's kind of like, because they're hair. Like, you take better care of your hair if you use conditioner. And then you hang them upside down to dry, because if they dry right side up, it causes breakage and it damages the brush. And you might be thinking, how do you hang it upside down to dry? And I had a hack where I just wrap a rubber band around it, and then I hang it from, like, you know, if you have blinds, there's like the little cord that comes down. There's a million different things you can do, but that's just one. Yeah, be clever, be courageous. And so some people will plan ahead. Like, I'm going to do some fine detail painting right here. And some people will plan ahead and they'll draw on the canvas ahead of time before they start painting. And they'll draw with like pencil or Conti, which is, I think we cover that in one of these modules. I don't know off the top of my head. But, yeah, just depends how much planning you like to do ahead of time. Since this is a demo, I'm not really going to go into planning ahead of time. I'm just going to write the word like right here. This is going in with like finer detail. Here's an L. I don't know if you can see that. So yeah, these finer tip brushes are better if you're working with like the really detailed stuff. Yeah, but that's like going into calligraphy and all that. So, yeah, bigger the brush, broader the stroke. Skinnier the brush, finer the stroke. And the more fine detail you can get. I hope that was informative and exciting and encourages you guys to get to painting.